Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton.
I'm Delnaz Kazemi, one of your co-hosts.
And today we are so excited to be joined by a fantastic guest to talk all about the latest presidential polls and some new trends that show the possibility of young voters and voters of color sort of shifting off of supporting Democrats in their traditional manner. So, Sophia, do you want to give a brief introduction before we start things off here?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sophia DeLoretto-Chudy. I'm happy to be here. I have always been really interested in youth voters and youth voter turnout and, keeping up with all of this and every transition that I've taken in my career. I've worked in South Texas, I've worked in Georgia, I've worked in Los Angeles. I worked for organizations as big as the Women's March and as small as little nonprofits that you've never even heard of. So I'm really excited to be here and be a part of this conversation today. Thank you for having me.
We're very excited to have you join us today for a really important discussion because I think there's been a lot made about these polls in the media recently, but there hasn't been a lot from a youth perspective. So I think that that's something that we at Pod Save the Youth were really hoping to give to these discussions of the polls, and I think we'll do that today. So just to kind of summarize the New York Times poll that kind of shocked the media and the public recently, the poll showed that Donald Trump was leading in 5 out of the 6 key swing states in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, where he led kind of unexpectedly by double digits. In the state with the highest percentage of voters of color, specifically Latino voters and young voters, the poll showed that Donald Trump was close to 50% in these states where he led. And that's mostly because he's consolidated most of the Republican vote and is starting to take some independence off of the margins and towards his campaign versus the Biden campaign, which is appealing to most Democrats, getting around 40% in recent polls in swing states, but still having some trouble consolidating, the traditional Democratic base, possibly over the issue of the war in Gaza. The driver of these numbers for the majority of swing voters, though, seems to be, kind of unsurprisingly, the economy. Latino voters and young voters shifted to being around 50-50 for either candidate versus their 60-point margin for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. So I'll ask either one of you this first question here today. So are young people just behaving kind of more like older voters in these recent polls? Are they more concerned about, traditional issues like the economy? Or are there specific economic drivers for younger voters and voters of color that we're seeing here?
Oh, great question. I mean, first, I want to point out that the thing that I think is most concerning about this specific poll with the 5 key states is that the reason why the Democrats claim that they ran Joe Biden again is because he only needs to win 5 states. We've got it in the bag if he can win these 5 states. So that was really shocking for all of us to see, I know. But I don't want to say that young people are behaving the same as older generations. I think when young people talk about the economy, they are actually referring to different things than the older generations are. So young people are talking about job availability, about wages, about rent. And when older generations are talking about the economy, they're generally talking about the stock market and the 401ks and their retirement funds and their multiple houses that they might own. And so I think it's really important that we talk about the economy, but I don't think that we can lump older generations and younger generations into the same groups when we are talking about the economy. And the same can be said for Latino voters. I think they have a very similar perspective when it comes to the economy.
I don't have anything to add. I 100% agree because I think both older people, older voters and young people, they are 2 groups that really are caring about the economy at this stage. But like you said, very different things that are affecting them on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that too. But I'll also ask, is there kind of a real economic policy that younger voters and voters of color seem to be kind of moving away from the Biden administration on or because of? Or is it kind of just based on the fact that these voters aren't really aware of who's causing these economic pains that exist in the American public right now?
I think there's 2 parts to this answer. And I think one is that a lot of people have this kind of like, we all had a lobotomy after Biden got elected about how bad things were under Trump. And people often forget, if you're not studying political science and paying close attention to these things, you don't realize that the president that follows is the one who's going to get credit for whatever the president before did when it comes to the economy. And so, if things look bad under Joe Biden, it's because often they were set up to be failures under the former president. And we forget, I think we elected Joe Biden, and then a lot of young people are like, oh, I get to stop caring again, like everything's going to be fine. And they forget about the repercussions of everything that happened in the Trump administration. And I think our brains kind of also paused at, right before COVID happened. And so there's this weird fog in our brain about COVID and the economy. And so people, for some reason or another, reflect very positively on the economy under Trump pre-COVID and don't really acknowledge the fact that, these are factors that were not maybe within his control even. And then I think, unfortunately, too, that Joe Biden made a lot of promises to young people regarding the economy. And I mean, I know there's been plenty of different challenges, like legal challenges specifically when it comes to things like student loan forgiveness, but we are seeing, there were big promises about life is going to get easier under Joe Biden. You're going to see wage growth, you're going to see strength in unions and the value of your degree, and that just hasn't happened. And so I think there's a little bit of remorse towards, oh, I put in that work to elect Joe Biden, and now I've been struggling this whole time that he's been president.
I would like to add one thing. I come across a lot of young people who it seems that they became politically active only after Joe Biden was elected. So as you said, you remind them of certain things that happened under Donald Trump, and they genuinely either don't know or forgot or didn't realize the intensity of how bad it was. And then there's a shift like, oh, maybe Trump isn't good once you remind them of certain events that happened pre-COVID, especially. But yeah, it's almost as if either some sort of memory loss is going on with the issue, or young people, became older. Maybe they were younger during Trump's presidency. They became politically active now. They notice all these things going on, and they look at who's in charge, and they're unsure of what caused that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll add to what you were saying, Sophia. I think that it must be hard for the Biden administration right now because they did bring us back economically from the conditions of the pandemic, which was their promise, right? They built that from a recession, right? And now we're at a time where, we had a soft landing from the heights of inflation. And I think they internally kind of struggle to grapple with the fact that people still are struggling, even though it wasn't quite as bad as 2020. And just to kind of tie that into what you were saying, Delnaz, I agree. People do have a memory span, and it's especially short when people still feel the pains of the economy.
1 in 5 young people is in credit card debt, like have maxed out credit cards. And that is a shocking number. And I think that there's an issue too with how we measure the health of the economy in this country. We often are looking at like the Dow Jones, and that's not something that young people are necessarily a part of. And so when we say, oh, the economy looks strong or it looks healthy, a lot of young people are still saying, I can't afford groceries, and you're writing about my grocery expenses as if they're luxuries, like because I want to try to eat organic. And I think it's really it's like a disillusionment that young people have towards what are we talking about when we talk about the economy. Like, I'm not sitting comfortably and I'm not enjoying life in the way that I see that older generations are. And I know we see all this data about it's older generations that own these 2 to 3 bedroom homes, but there's only a single couple living in them. And like, how is this wealth being redistributed in this country? And so I think it's a big disillusionment, especially when it comes to how we talk about the economy and what a good economy looks like in the eyes of young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also harder to be an incumbent, right? And at a time where people are struggling because the challenger, which in this case is Donald Trump, can just say, look at the economy before COVID. Don't forget about everything. It's not my fault. And Joe Biden has messed things up. And it's a lot easier if someone else has messed things up than to say your plans to actually fix it. And I think one of the
Right.
groups that Donald Trump is targeting with this economic message really heavily and to a successful degree is Hispanic voters, right? We saw
Hmm.
that the highest shifts, the largest shifts in this recent poll came from the Hispanic voting bloc, which also extends a trend that we've seen in 2020 and in 2022 in the midterms. And I guess I'll ask the question to you, are these trends with Hispanic voters, do we think that they are because of the Trump campaign's efforts to, drive home their economic and public safety message, or are they kind of in spite of them and just because of the poor conditions that so many people are in right now?
I have an interesting perspective on this as someone who lives in Texas and started a nonprofit in South Texas, where we saw the largest shift red in from 2016 to 2020. I think that there is two things happening at once, which is that Donald Trump is going after that working person kind of economic pitch, even though he is so far from it. He is like a failed liar billionaire who's lied about his wealth. But he makes it seem like his macho-y smoke can make the American dream happen for anybody. And a lack of investment in Latino communities from Democrats. I think that a lot of what we saw in 2016 with young people and the Democratic vote, which was that young people were taken for granted. They were expected to vote one way, and then it was shocking when they didn't turn out to vote at all. The same thing was true in 2020 when Hispanics were expected to vote for Democrats. And there wasn't a lot of investment. I mean, when we look at South Texas specifically, like 30 days before the election, Democrats were running ads that were translated into Spanish that were not talking about issues that Hispanic people cared about in their own words. They were dubbed over into Spanish, and it was a complete failure as far as like actually reaching out and addressing the needs of Hispanics in at least specifically South Texas. So I think it's a little bit challenging because they have this person who's messaging to them while the other person is not in many ways. And so I think they're trying harder to make up for that gap, but I don't know. It's really hard to fall into that and then come out of it.
Yeah, I guess I'll ask also, do you think that some of this could be helped by candidates like Ruben Gallego, people who identify as Hispanic, running for top offices in the United States? And also, he's kind of a unique person because he does often talk about the economic crisis that so many people are in right now. He grew up in poverty, I think struggling with homelessness at one point, and kind of talking about his success story like he does on the campaign trail a lot of the time. Do you
Yeah,
think that
I actually do think no, I think that's a really good strategy. And I think it's even more important than having Joe Biden go down there himself, because when a candidate, especially a older white candidate, shows up in a predominantly Hispanic area and says, you need to vote for me because I'm going to do what's best for you. And they show up, in the year before the election, it feels incredibly transactional. And a lot of the disillusionment among the Hispanic community towards formal politics comes from this lack of investment, like long-term investment, and showing up only during election time and speaking as if they know what's best for the community. And saying like, this guy hates you, like you got to vote for me because this other guy hates you. It's way more powerful to have somebody who's within that community show up and say, hey, this is tough, but I'm going to be doing this right here with you. Like, me, I know the challenges that you are facing. And to have a trusted speaker come out and be that person, I think is way more impactful than having, someone show up from Washington, D.C. and say, hey, you got to remember to vote for me because I'm the guy who doesn't hate you as much as that guy does.
100%. Yeah. And something I also want to talk about that kind of seems to be just not catching on with voters right now is the sheer extremism of this year's Trump campaign. They go to rallies, they talk to their supporters outside of the courthouse every day, and they say outlandish things, about how Trump's being targeted, about guns, about abortion, about policing. I think he said that people who are homeless recently should go to internment camps, which is
Yeah.
just something that's unbelievable and also unbelievably unpopular. He talks about, arresting immigrants. And then he talks about being a dictator on day one. All these things are incredibly unpopular with voters, yet they are not catching on in this media environment because I think so many people in the media and in the public are kind of numb to Trump's extremism. They've seen it for years and they kind of think that nothing new can happen, even though this is nothing like he talked about in 2016. This is so much more extreme. He's laying out his plans for Project 2025, right?
Mm-hmm.
He is talking about this possible, authoritarian leadership in an incredibly extreme way. And I think people need to pay more attention to that. But I'll ask the question, do young people talk about this, extremism in their daily lives? Or I mean, I guess I'm a young person, I can answer this too. In your lives too, have your friends and family and people who are young, have they been talking about this extremism, or are they kind of numb to it too?
I think there's definitely a numbness. I think we really became desensitized to how so extreme and radical the things that he says are, and he likes to chalk it up as a joke so often that people are like, he's not actually that serious. Like he talks a big game. I think also there has kind of been this overcorrection. I think in 2016 there was so much attention on what Donald Trump was saying, and it was constantly giving him free airtime. And there was a big criticism of that in the media following his election to the presidency. And so now there's been this really big overcorrection, which is, let's not give Donald Trump too much free airtime for the crazy things that he says. But then by doing that, we're also not hearing it often. He's saying at these rallies and these protests and his campaign events, but who's going to those? It's the media and his supporters. It's not young people. It's not being covered on platforms like Meta is really limited their political, any kind of political content that's showing up. So we're not seeing these headlines about things that he's saying unless you are a news junkie and you're paying attention. They took him off of Twitter. I mean, he's been technically allowed back by Elon Musk, but he'd rather be on Truth Social. But who's on Truth Social? It's not young people as far as I'm aware of. And so we're not seeing these really outlandish things that he's saying as much. So we're not talking about them. And then when it does get brought up, you're like, hey, did you hear that Donald Trump wants to put immigrants into internment camps? People are like, yeah, but he said that before, right? And it's like, no, he hasn't. This is a new level of crazy, but we're so desensitized to it because we're so used to the craziness that he says, and nobody takes him seriously because he's laying out his plans step by step. This is what I want to do for Project 2025, but everyone's just looking at it like, oh, that's a pipe dream. He's not serious.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, my hands started sweating and everything. And even though my area of interest is extremism, I sometimes see these headlines and I'm like, oh man, that Trump, and then I suddenly snap back to reality. I'm like, no, that's not normal. And as for the conversations between my peers or family, it's the same thing. I can bring up one of the examples and I tell them, oh my gosh, did you hear this? It's ridiculous. And they're like, oh yeah, that crazy Trump. And I'm like, hello, what about a few years ago? Many things happened. Were you not, looking at it? But I mean, it's really easy to become numb to it, just like other issues that are going on. I feel like people, and in a way, I'm not expecting every single person to be hardcore, crying about it every single day, but it is really a bad issue. And I think people don't realize that it is actually serious. It's not just Trump talking. It is his plan, and it can get really, really, really ugly, especially the second time around. I mean, it was already really bad the first time around. Don't know what's going to look like the second time around.
Yeah. What I hear when I talk to young people is mostly, yeah, well, he probably shouldn't be saying that, but we lived through it the first time, right? We it was hard, but we made it, right? And he's not going to do anything new that he wouldn't do in his first term. But that's not true because he's not going to have the check of another election. He's not going to have to worry about getting reelected, right? He is going to have no checks. And especially if they get a Republican Congress, House and Senate this year, which is very possible, he could have absolutely no checks on his power, which means he will do these things that he says he's going to do. And
Yeah.
yeah, and the people who did suffer in the last Trump administration were the most vulnerable, the people without the platform. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why we don't hear their stories too often.
I did want to add too, as you were saying that, it reminded me, the people who are the most vulnerable among the young people are paying attention and hear it and are scared. And then there are more privileged young people who don't have to pay attention because if these things happen, they feel like it won't affect them. And that's really sad and difficult to grapple with also. But there are, there are still young people who don't pay attention to politics until it's the week before the election. And then they go and vote based off of a vibe. And sometimes someone who's saying outlandish things, who they feel like is speaking more honestly to them and more authentically to them, is the vibe that they want to choose, which is hard and which is scary. And I think there's also a failure within our education system in how government works and how checks and balances work, and how there were checks and balances in place when, at least in Donald Trump's second, half of his term in office, his first term in office, we won back Congress, and that was what helped us not fall into these traps and have all these horrible, terrible things happen. But people don't honestly know how that all works unless you're paying close attention or you're really interested in it and you're seeking out that education on your own.
Yeah. And I guess there's kind of two avenues that the Biden campaign could kind of go down to change these trends that are really concerning right now, or people just aren't paying attention to extremism. They could talk about it, or they could try to change the what seems like more salient issues of economics, right? So I'll ask you both, like, what do you think is the best strategy here for the Biden campaign to do? Do you think that they should be talking more about their economic vision for a second term, which I don't think it is breaking through to young people either, or should they be talking more about the racism, the misogyny, the craziness that a second Trump term would bring to the United States?
It's a very difficult question because in one way, young people are really not responsive to like negative advertising. They don't want to hear the negative, horrible things. They don't want you bashing on your opponent. On the other hand, it is really important to talk about the terrible things that he's promising to do. And then, we want a vision for the future, but it's really difficult to talk about a vision for the future when, oh, you had 4 years to, push through your vision for the future. Why are you promising the same things over and over again? And we didn't see much, get done, or it didn't go as far as we want it to go. So it's a difficult line to walk. I think that I don't think all the attention should be focused on Donald Trump in a negative way, but we need to have pretty frequent reminders of how extreme the things he says are. And I think that you can kind of balance both by saying, here's what I'm going to do. And just a reminder, this is what the other guy said. So that you can have a little bit of a balance, because if you just go for straight negative, it's going to turn a lot of people off and just make you look like a whiny baby. Even though you have good reason to be whining and crying, and we know that, but not everybody will. And you can't just focus on your vision for the future and pretend that the other person doesn't exist when you are the incumbent. Like we said before, it's really difficult to be running as an incumbent, especially when it comes to the economy.
I agree with what you said. One thing that I think they should do, this is similar to what you said, not entirely focus on Trump, but definitely more comparisons, because even though young people don't love just negativity all the time, I think when just an average young person sees, these are my plans for the future, they're gonna be like, oh, like a political post, like, okay, not so interesting. However, I don't know what organization, but I've seen some think tanks and other organizations post some anti-Trump / pro-Biden ads and things like that, and they were like really strong, really hard-hitting, emotional almost. They weren't shallow, they weren't like name calling or anything like that, but they were like, it was almost like a documentary type but very short, and I think those would work and those would be much more effective. And I'm sure they have experimented with that. I'm trying to recall certain things I may have seen, but I think focusing more on those types of campaigns would be good, showing exactly what would happen and what had happened, under Donald Trump.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
definitely do need those reminders.
yeah. I think one of the most salient issues that the Biden campaign is talking about when it comes to extremism is the issue of abortion. And to what you were saying, Delnaz, I think one of the most salient ads that they've run so far has been an OBGYN in Texas who's
Mm-hmm.
an ad for Joe Biden and talks about her experience actually having a pregnancy that was not viable, that she wanted to have, but she was unable to, and she was unable also to access the support and the care that she needed in her state of Texas. I just thought that was a very strong ad, and I think it reaches young people. So you can go look that up too. It's a good one to watch. But I think that when we talk about the economy versus social issues, I think we make a mistake by just focusing on the data that's in the polls right now,
Mm-hmm.
because I think what we see is often the economy is what people just say is their top issue, right? People want to say like, oh, well, I mean, I'm concerned most about whether I'm going to be able to put food on the table, obviously, right? But just because it's the top issue that people care about doesn't necessarily mean it's the top issue that people are going to be voting on, especially young people who could be receptive to issues like political extremism, like abortion. I think that's what happened in 2022 in the midterms. But one of these more salient issues that I think could be less favorable to Democrats with young people, that young people could be voting on, could be the war in Gaza. And right now, 13% of young people who said that this was their top concern were in the recent New York Times poll were unwilling to support Joe Biden in the fall against Donald Trump, a number that would be extremely detrimental to his campaign, probably lose him the states that he is currently losing in the polls. And this 13% has been roughly similar to the amount of the vote that the uncommitted movement has achieved in the states where they've contested the ballot, in Michigan and Minnesota, right?
Mm-hmm.
They actually got higher than 13%. But I guess I'll ask this: although it's not the top concern right now for young people in polls, does the appearance of chaos on the world stage due to the war in Gaza reflects poorly on the Biden administration with young people?
Yeah. And I think, we can talk about all the things that we care about, all the issues that young people care about. It's not that young people don't care. That's always my biggest issue. It's not that young people don't care. They care a lot, and they're going to talk about the issues that they care about. We can say that we care about the economy. We can say that we care about women's reproductive rights. We can say that we care about the rollback of LGBTQ rights. We're seeing a regression in rights for our marginalized communities. We care about those issues. The problem is that formal politics doesn't always seem to be the way to solve those issues. And we hear often that, politicians don't keep us safe. We keep us safe. That politicians aren't going to save us. We take care of each other and we take care of our community. And so we can, we hear that the economy is our number one issue that we care about, on an issue stance, right? But the feeling that we have is that our democracy is failing. And so, like, who can we trust if we are going out into the street and marching, and students are building encampments on their campuses and their own campus administrations aren't listening to them? It feels like there is this top-down power that we cannot fight from the bottom up through a formal political system. And so this move to vote uncommitted, it is a protest vote. It's a very powerful thing because it shows how many numbers people have, and it's a safe way to do a protest vote. Should be really, really scary. I know that they're taking it lightly and they don't want to show that they're scared on the outside, but it's a really scary number because we don't have big margins, in states, especially in states like Michigan. It is not big margins that we have to play with. It is really, really small numbers. And so people not showing up to vote, not even voting for Donald Trump, but just not showing up to vote at all, is going to be wildly problematic. But a lot of the conversations that I'm having with folks is that, what is the point if we have this person, especially when it comes to the issue of the war in Gaza, we have somebody in office who's supposed to listen to us, who promised that they were going to be the better one. And then you see a refugee camp having a bomb dropped on it that was built in the United States, that was funded by the UK, and it's setting fire to a camp that was supposed to be safe. And people will say, oh, but it would be worse under Donald Trump. Of course it would be worse under Donald Trump, but it's still not necessarily better under Biden in these terms, like, because we are out here. I don't know if you know this, but I was arrested on April 29th on the University of Texas campus. We're out here asking for like the smallest things. Like, it is so freaking weird that a campus would have a university would have ties to weapons sales in a foreign country. So it feels like you're asking for these really small things from your leaders, and yet you're being treated by a fascist police force is the response that you're getting. And so you think to yourself, what is the point? Like, who, if this person was supposed to be beholden to the people and they're showing me that they're not, what is the point of coming out and voting? And like, at the end of the day, I'm not going to be mad at a single voter who chooses not to show up. It'll hurt, it'll be disappointing, but I'm not going to hold it against them when we have had so many opportunities. Our parties have had so many opportunities to appeal to young people, to listen, to respond more appropriately to the demands that are being asked of the millions of people that have taken to the streets. And this really strong sense of disillusionment that is reminiscent of the Vietnam era, and how young people were treated during that time. And yes, we made it through that, but just like barely. And so I think it is something that should really scare us. And in my personal conversations with other young people, they're really difficult. It's not, I mean, I thought it was hard talking in 2016. I thought it was hard talking to people in 2020, but it's even more hard this year, because the only thing that I can come up with to try to at least convince people who are thinking about staying home is that, yes, it feels catastrophic right now. And it is. But at the same time, when our forces are spread so thin, fighting little fires everywhere, like, we have a big fire right now that we are able to put a lot of attention to, and a couple other little fires that we can kind of dip into. When all of us are spread so thin, fighting little fires everywhere, there's no way we're going to be able to take on any big fires. And so we not even voting for ourselves and our own interests, but voting for the fact that we are able to build community a lot easier under this leader than we would under Donald Trump, where we are going to be just at the spread the farthest thin possible, trying to fight back every horrible thing that he has planned. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to say, oh, well, it's young people's fault for not showing up. It is the situation that we're in, and I wish it was better, and I wish that our president was responding better and addressing us in a different way. And so I think it's going to be something really tricky to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the strongest messages you can make to people who are protesting. And I think, sadly, the Biden campaign is not investing a lot in finding those messengers to make that message to people, because I think that there's a general sense in the party headquarters that this is just a small group, right? Some of these people are not going to vote anyway, right? It's not the people who we need to be targeting.
Mm-hmm.
Every single little bit counts in this election. And I mean, I know there are people who are saying, Michigan, it doesn't matter if, we lose Arab support, if we lose young people support, because in 2022, we got, so much support in Gretchen Whitmer's race from white voters. It wouldn't matter. You're not going to win by 10 points this time. It's going to be, if you win, it's going to be less than a point probably. Joe Biden's going to need every little bit of support he can get. And starting with those organizers like you, Sophia, telling that message to people is the first place to start. But obviously, this is much more of a policy problem than an organizing problem, than a messaging problem.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, it's just some of the things that we're hearing too are just, it's mind-boggling that, he could come out and say that disruption on campus is the worst thing that could be happening right now. And it's like, are we on the same planet? Like,
Right.
what?
And I think often this also kind of ties into the age message, where a lot of people who are young see Biden not responding in the way they would like to this war, and then say, well, it's because he's old, right? It's because he's disconnected. It's because he doesn't see us or care about us. And in that sense, they don't necessarily see Trump as better, but they see the parties as the same. And if this is the most salient going into November, I think Democrats are in big trouble up and down the ballot.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly strong point, actually, that people need to recognize. It's that when especially young people are treated in this way on their college campuses, the parties do come off as the same. They come off as being just as equally bad as each other. And the issue, I think, that often a lot of centrist candidates do is that they say, oh, well, at least if I lean a little bit left, I'll be more left than the other guy. So the leftists will have to vote for me. The people on the left will have to vote for me. But what you actually end up doing is just convincing them to not show up at all, because they don't see the point and they don't see how you're better in the slightest.
I also think that even though this isn't really a policy problem, there is also a messaging problem that we have to talk about too. So for many young people in the U.S., the U.S. support for Israel and also for the fossil fuel industry, because I think there are many young people who are upset about both policies of the Biden administration, are kind of not are in their rabbit holes, right? Are not really seeing any other information that counters those points right now. And this makes it seem, again, like the two parties are the same, like there's not going to be any change versus, in Biden versus Trump. And if you're only hearing, and this is what I hear in my focus groups too, young people only say the policies that they're able to point to from the Biden administration are the Willow Project and support for Israel. And if that is what young people think the Biden administration has been doing for the past 4 years, I mean, these numbers are completely understandable. So, I mean, I just think that the amount of information that young people are getting from the Biden administration about their full policy agenda over the past 4 years is not at all adequate for a campaign that asks for their votes again. And it's a massive problem going into this campaign and this election cycle. But I'll ask, so should the Biden team be focusing more attention on, at this point, on drawing attention to Donald Trump's extremism, or should they be talking about Biden's policies? Kind of similar to a question I asked before about like economics, but just specifically about Biden, about raising awareness about Biden's policies over the last 4 years, or kind of talking about what Donald Trump would do over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think one of the really difficult things about our government and how our country is set up is that we don't have a good marketing department for good government. And so even though Biden has had one of the most progressive like environmental terms in office in our history, the Willow Project was super, super negative in the eyes of tons of environmentalists who supported him, especially because the promise was that he would not sign any more oil and gas leases and he would not do anything that Donald Trump had done before. And I think that absolutism really created a difficult place for him to be in when things like the Willow Project happened. And there is not conversation about the really positive things that he's been able to accomplish and that Congress has been able to accomplish with him as the president. And how much worse, like Donald Trump wants to sell off all of Anwar, like all of the Arctic like refugee, like literally wants to sell the whole thing off to oil and gas. And that'll happen. I mean, like, I think, what is it, Bears Ears in Utah or New Mexico, and just all of these different places. I can't remember what everything is called, but I just know that those are protected right now, and that'll be completely gone if Donald Trump is elected again. And I think that we forget how serious that is when we aren't talking about it. So I do think that is a messaging problem, that it's hard to, you can't just go and say, oh, but I did this when I've also done this really terrible thing. I think there needs to be a level of accountability. Like, yes, the Willow Project happened. It's not my best look. I'm not super proud of it. I want to be working, like, I want to move away from stuff like that. And I'm here to listen to you guys and have you push me hard on this. And I'm hearing you and I'm hearing what you want. And I'm willing to like move in the direction that you want to push me. I'm so scared of what Donald Trump is going to do if he is elected. And I think that there needs to be like a level of accountability and authenticity in that regard. I know you're not supposed to like admit to your own mistakes when you are a politician, but like I think there's a level of authenticity that's missing when you don't. The fossil fuel, I mean, like, it's just insane. We're seeing numbers out of the UN that says like we are reaching a point of no return. And so it feels like we are at these really dramatic moments where there's not dramatic action happening, and it turns a lot of people off and makes it feel like we need to take things into our own hands. If we want to see change, we need to go to join Standing Rock, you know? And then I think when it comes to Israel also, it's there is a messaging problem that this hugging Bibi Netanyahu is obviously not a policy that works, but it's what, you know, Donald Trump is going to do 10 times worse. Like we do need to be talking about the fact that Bibi Netanyahu wants Donald Trump to be president. So if you are anti-Bibi Netanyahu, you need to also be anti-Donald Trump. You can't, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And so if you are afraid of what Bibi is capable of doing, like you should be extremely afraid of what Bibi is going to do if his friend Donald Trump is elected and not his enemy Joe Biden, who's had a really terrible policy, like foreign policy with him that makes absolutely no sense. Like I'm going to secretly behind closed doors threaten to maybe one day consider pulling funding. Doesn't really work. But here's actually all of our nuclear arsenal, have at it, is what the alternative is. And we do need to be talking about both of those things. But I think that there needs to be more just accountability and authenticity when it comes to that kind of messaging. It can't all just be positive. It can't all just be like, but look at the pretty things I did. It has to be like, I know I'm not where everybody wants me to be, but like let's work together towards it instead of, you know, give it off to this guy to spite me.
I really like what you said about reflecting on the not so pretty things. I think that's very important for him, Biden's campaign to do. Also, I would, in addition to that, kind of stick with the answer that I said before, that they do need to focus more on really like hard-hitting comparisons with Trump. And within those campaigns include, you know, this is what my promises will be, you know, if Trump is not in the White House, and it'll be great, you know, something along those lines, but at the same time showing Trump's history and his future plans as well. Because as we talked about earlier, people are not only desensitized to what he's talking about now, Trump, and they also don't seem to either remember or weren't aware of what was happening before. So really just need to do everything at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, something that came up in my recent focus group with young people was the fact that they obviously don't like the policy towards Israel right now. And they said, you know what, when Donald Trump was in office, we weren't in any wars, which is actually not accurate because of Afghanistan, but it is this, as you said, Delnaz, this amnesia that young people have towards the Trump administration, where people in our generation sometimes just can't seem to remember what was going on, and also can't seem to think, you know, in the future, what could Trump be like if the conditions of today were applied to his policies? Because the situation, you know, is that Israel was not in a conflict with Gaza in the same extent that it is right now. Obviously, they've been in a conflict for a very long time, but certainly not like what it is like right now. But I think a lot of young people just can't picture what Donald Trump, a previous president with a record of being president, would be like today, handling the crises we have right now. I'll ask kind of one more question. I think one policy that could in the future, I mean like over the next few weeks and months, make the Biden administration even more unpopular with young people could be the TikTok ban.
Oh yeah.
So I'm wondering what you all think about this and what effect this could have on the race.
Yeah, not looking great. I think that the TikTok ban, it's difficult because if you are really into national security and foreign policy, like you might be able to rationalize the TikTok ban, right? There is some level of, oh, maybe, you know, like a foreign government having all this data accessible especially during an election year, isn't the best for national security. If you're kind of a policy wonk in that regard, if you are just a normal young person and you have been facing tons of different challenges in your life, if you have limited access to healthcare, if you have mounting student loans, if you are trying to get married and you can't afford your wedding venue and you not much less buy a house, and then you see how quickly Congress can come together to ban TikTok, it's really it's difficult to not want to laugh at our political system, to not want to laugh at our government, and think it's all a joke, because we also know that our data is constantly being collected and sold by everyone else. You know, why does it make it better if American Mark Zuckerberg owns my data if he's also just selling it to every other foreign government and no one's keeping tabs on that? You know, they're constant. Our facial recognition is everywhere. Our data is already being sold. Also, what are you going to take from me? My $90,000 in student loan debt? Like, take my data, you know? I'm like, you want to see that I care about watching like cow videos on TikTok? Like, that's what it becomes incredibly laughable. And then it also becomes really disheartening because you see how quickly they come together to ban TikTok. If you will watch any of the clips of the hearings, half of them don't know what TikTok is. They don't even call it TikTok. They call it like Talk or TikTok or whatever. They have no idea what they're even talking about. And it just it makes you want to laugh in a really sad way, because you're like, why is this the issue, right? And then things that happen too, like I had a small influence on TikTok for a short while, and I was using it to bring awareness to all of the crazy policies that the Texas legislature was trying to enact. And then once I started talking about Israel and Gaza, my TikTok just completely got shadow banned. I'll post a video and within seconds it'll get 400 views and then nothing for the rest of forever, despite having, 60,000 some followers. It's just really not a good look. I think it is the wrong approach. I think it is stupid. I think that it's also a lot of the people, like if you want to reach young people, you got to do it through influencers at this point. Like if you got to get to the people who are talking to the young people are way more trusting of each other and the people that they follow on the internet. And so if you want to win them over, banning the app that they use for their livelihoods and for how they get their information and from the sources that they trust, not a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. And I think everyone can agree that TikTok has flaws. I mean, no one's saying that TikTok's perfect, but a lot of the, concerns that I and I'm assuming others have also relate to other social media platforms. I said Instagram, Meta, whatever, Facebook. And I don't know a single young person who's like, oh wow, what a great move banning TikTok. I mean, it's just horrible that this is even out there right now. Just not a good idea. No.
Stay away, stay far away.
I think we've given some amazing advice today to Democratic campaigns across the country. So Sophia, also, where can people go to support your work in Texas?
Oh yeah. I am working on a project right now that is I'm trying to measure the impact of nonpartisan voter information. Like we talked about, young people just don't love that negative the messaging that a lot of times you get when you've only received information from candidates. something that I want to research and study is the impact of having just strictly nonpartisan voter information, how that would impact youth voter turnout specifically in Texas, where we don't have things like a voter guide coming out in the mail. It's one of the hardest states to vote in. And if you are not connected to a party, you're honestly not going to be reached out to by anybody about an election that's coming up. So I have this research project. It's called the Texas Voter Project. You can find it at texasvoterproject.org, where I am going to be doing this really fun research project, sending voter guides out with really basic election information to 18 to 35-year-olds in Travis County. And if it's successful, which I hope that it is, it will get to turn into a larger nonprofit and really challenge a lot of the voting barriers that have been set up in this state, and hopefully can be a model that other states can use. So check out texasvoterproject.org.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This has been Pod Save the Youth. See you next week.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.